Okay, in this video we're going to cover the nature of ethics and some of the challenges associated with it, in particular as a military service member. So ultimately what we need to be able to do is understand what level of ethics we're talking about in the context of ethics for a warfighting organization. And we'll start with meta-ethics, that it's ultimately the study of the fundamental nature of what constitutes good and evil. This is an interesting topic. It's worth spending time studying, but ultimately it's super conceptual, super broad, and super vague. From meta-ethics, we go into normative ethics, which is an approach that's designed to provide overarching rules and philosophies of what constitutes right and wrong conduct. So a great first step in getting a bit more focused than the realm of meta-ethics. But ultimately, it's challenging because it's difficult to come up with baseline rules for all peoples when it comes to the topic of ethics. Meta-ethics, it's not quite as focused as we would need it to be in the military. So the next progression from normative ethics is applied ethics. And for the US military, having an applied ethic is ultimately all about coming up with baseline rules and philosophies that help govern members of the military to establish what is right and what is wrong conduct for those in the armed forces. It's ultimately here at this level of applied ethics that this book is focused on. So with that, we have to establish a baseline understanding of what ethics is, and we start with this definition, that ethics is the adherence of one's actions to their values. And that values are the principles, concepts, traits, qualities that are deemed important to an individual or an organization. And then from there, morals are the concern for the principles of what is right and wrong. So when discerning between these three words that are oftentimes used almost interchangeably, I'd like to fall back on an analogy provided by a philosopher named Jack Hoban, who wrote a great book called Ethical Warrior. And in it, he uses a bully analogy, that if a child sees a kid being beat up by a bully and looks at that situation and says, that action does not coincide with my values, that is wrong. Because they've made a determination of right and wrong, that person is now moral. But because they have not acted on their values, they haven't become ethical yet. Again, ethics is the adherence of one's actions to their values. So in order to become ethical, the child would have to do something to stop the bully. If they run off and go get a teacher or the principal or something else, or yell at the bully to stop, then they're ethical. If they get between the bully and the kid who's getting beat up, now the child is an ethical warrior. So what are military ethics? Military ethics are the adherence of one's actions to the characteristics or qualities, the values, that are valuable to a military organization. That's it. Ultimately, those are the traits that help us succeed in war. One of the challenges of talking about the subject of ethics is that there are multiple sources of values that everybody brings with them even before they join the military. So every serviceman or woman, Marine in this case, can pull values from their religion, political affiliation, pull values from their family, various organizations that they were a part of prior to joining the service or while they're in the service. Geographic background, right? The values in Biloxi, Mississippi are different than the ones in San Francisco, which are different than the ones in Boise, Idaho, which are different than the ones in Boston or New York. And then people's occupations bring values as well. And a person can be a part of all of these entities. The question then becomes, which value sources are you going to adhere to? So any understanding of ethics has to start with an understanding of values. But ultimately, it's up to the individual to reflect on those values, and that's really important. And when you do, you create something called a moral lens, where you start to see things in the context of your values. And that's how you start to assess whether or not something is right or wrong, when you start to be moral. And when you do see things as right or wrong, you're ultimately compelled to act. That's what drives you to do something. Once you take action, that's how you become ethical. So one of the challenges when we talk about adhering to our values and reflecting on our what our values mean, one of the things we do need to take time to reflect on is which value source is going to take precedent when we make decisions. One of the challenges we run into is that people are confronted with ethical dilemmas, which are presented kind of in one of two ways. An ethical dilemma defined here is a conflict between the application of two or more values or value sources. So an example of an ethical dilemma is somebody who feels compelled to serve in the military, which is a warfighting organization, but would have, say, a religious belief that you're not supposed to be violent. And ultimately, it's difficult to reconcile that with our understanding that war requires us to apply sanctioned violence in a controlled, focused, and lawful way, but violent nonetheless. That can cause an ethical dilemma for somebody, and ultimately they're going to have to make a decision as to which role is more important to them. Another example would be political values that would compel somebody to say things about members of their own political party who may be in office in either Congress or in the White House, or say something critical of somebody of the civilian leadership in Washington, D.C. But they'll have to square that up with the fact that the U.S. military is ultimately subordinate to our political leadership, in particular that the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief. One of the reasons why people tend to push war off to the side when talking about ethics is that they don't necessarily see a correlation. When it comes to the topic of ethics, people think it's far too often something that's a little too, for lack of a better phrase, touchy-feely, and that's not very relevant. So they either think it is something that is more akin to this type of image or this type of image, and that it could never be reconciled with the violent nature of war or war-fighting organizations. What we'd like to be able to do is get people to understand, certainly in the military, is that when we talk ethics, we're talking about images like this. When we want to understand ethics, images like this should come to mind. And that ultimately ethics, when we focus in the military, is all about sending somebody out into the unknown, into an environment of chaos, friction, violence, and uncertainty, and that when they do come into contact with the enemy that may be in superior numbers and strength, that when they call for support, when they call for the team to converge on them, that from the ground and then from the air, the U.S. military will bring its resources to bear to help overwhelm the enemy and be successful. And that ethics ultimately is about generating combat power and winning the nation's wars in any climate and any place.